Hi, welcome to my first painting video. I'm Sue Goodyjohn, and this video is to show my process when painting a pet portrait. We start with a photo, make a pencil drawing, and then use a kneaded eraser to erase most of that pencil drawing. We want to leave light lines just so we can see what our outline is, but not leave too dark of a line that will become permanent if it's painted. The initial process here is to paint in the background, and to do that we're making a wash of water where we want our painting to be. And the paint won't go where the paper's dry, it wants to go where it's wet, and so we can paint around our figure without worrying about the paint going where we don't want it. The water on the paper initially will help the paint flow in a more even layer to make a more even wash for the background. Once this process is done, we'll let it dry, and then we'll come back in and start laying in our design. Watercolor in general, you paint from light to dark. And the reason is that the paper, the white paper, is going to be your lightest lights. And so you need to preserve those lights. And so here we're laying in our shadows with a light color, but preserving the whitest whites for later on. And you generally don't have to worry too much about painting too darkly here, because the paint is gonna dry lighter than what it looks like when you put it on wet. So even if you think you get it a little too dark, you can always, it'll always dry a little bit lighter. If you end up with paint where you don't want it, you can add water and lift the color with a paper towel, or just smudge it and then start over with that area. At this stage, it's looking pretty rough and ugly, and it always goes through that stage, so don't worry. We're gonna get this underlying shadow layer in, and then we're gonna let it dry, and then we'll come in and put in more details and more layers, which will make it look much more what we expect for the finished product. I'm using a Fabriano paper, watercolor paper, for my paper. It's in a block form, which means that I took a pad of Fabriano paper, I put glue on all the sides to glue all the sides together, and that way it secures all the sides, so when the paper gets wet it doesn't tend to curl as much as a single piece of paper. You can use a single piece of paper and tape it down to your support board on all the edges, and that will do the same thing. But I like to use a block when I'm painting. The watercolor paint that I'm using is mostly Daniel Smith watercolor paints that I buy in a tube and then fill my pans with. And it's pretty good quality paint, I think. So here we've let it dry and we're coming back in with more detail. We need to put layers of color, so we're starting with the lightest layers and then working to the darkest layers. So in the eye area, he's got brown eyes, so we're going to start with a light layer of brown, maybe some yellow in there, and then here with the nose we're filling in more of the shadow, keeping the lighter areas for the highlights. So you always have to be cognizant of where your highlights are and try to preserve those if you can. There's ways of coming back and highlighting them with other either opaque white paint or a white gel pen, which will help, but we don't want to do too much of that because then it just doesn't look the same. So we want to preserve as much of the white as we can. And so here we're going to continue to layer. And we put down a layer of paint where the shadows are, and then we'll let it dry, and we'll come back, put down more detail, and then gradually working up the detail from there. The paint is always going to dry lighter than what you think it is. So we'll need to build in, especially these dogs with a lot of black. It's hard to get black with watercolor because the paint tends to dry lighter, and so you think it looks great and dark, and then you come back the next day and it's dried a lot lighter than what you expected, and you have to come back with another layer to get that contrast that you want with that painting. When I paint a lot of black, I like to use warm sepia and mix with Payne's gray, and then when I get to the darker dark, I mix in a little ivory black with that, and that gives me kind of a more natural brownish black, which is better for dogs. In general aren't black, they usually have a little bit of brown in with it. And then in the shadow areas, I like to use Moon Glow color, which is a nice kind of purplish tint to it, kind of a gray purple. The secret with the eyes is to not make them too flat, and the way to do that is not to fill in too much. We want to leave the edges uneven. We want to leave the color variable, and then make sure to leave reflections in the eye to give it some depth. We add a little brown here and there for the shadow, and just to give it a little more variation. We're going to darken the background a little bit to give it more contrast. Just building up our darks. I love the teeth on this dog. He's got a lot of personality. This painting is sped up a little bit, so it's not really real time. It's about 3 times real time. So you can keep that in mind as far as how fast this is going. And when you're painting the eyes, you don't want to put continuous line all the way around. You want to leave some space because the line will disappear here and there, and that gives it a more realistic look. If you make just a uniform round line around the eye, it'll flatten out your drawing and it'll make it look more like a caricature or a cartoon, and it won't look as realistic. So we want the unevenness. We want the line to disappear and then come back in. We want the edges to come in and out of focus because that'll make it look more realistic. And here you can see I'm continuously getting a little bit darker. It seems like I'm painting the same areas over and over, and I am, because every time I paint them a layer, it dries lighter. And then I come back in and I want more contrast, so then I put another layer on top of that and another layer on top of that. If you do it all at once, it just will look flat, and we don't want that. So it's okay that the edges are uneven. I'm still filling out my edges and my shadows. And the unevenness will make it look more realistic. Add a little bit of red into the inside of the ears, around the lip area, just a touch to give a little depth. Here we're going to come back in. We've let it dry overnight, and we're coming back in with our white jelly pen and putting in some slight highlights around the nose area, the teeth, definitely in the eyes. We want to bring out the white, just touches. And then I'm going to come back in. This is a India ink pen. I think it's I forget the brand. Anyway, to come in for the darks, just to darken the lines, just some minor line work. And then this is a little lighter variation of that same pen that I can use for a little bit of shading. Details. And then this is the funnest part of all. We've let it dry overnight, and now we're taking off the tape. And it's always so satisfying. You have that nice white border around the edge. If you look at the left lower side, there's a little bit of watercolor that's gone underneath the tape, which is not usually a big deal. You can take a little wet brush and wet it and blot it and lighten that up, and then you can come back with your jelly roll pen and cover it, and usually it will look fine. When I make the paper block, I leave a little opening at the bottom is where I put that nail file in. It's very important to do that so that you can then take the paper off the block. So you stick the nail file in and then run it around the edges to separate the top sheet from the rest of the block once the paper is dry, once the painting is dry. And then we're gonna sign it on the back. I don't sign it on the front. I put a symbol that are basically my initials, and then usually I sign my name on the back and the date. And then we put it in our sleeve with a piece of cardboard to fit, to support it during mailing. And then, of course, business card, very important, with information for referrals or reordering. And this painting's ready to be sent out to its new owner. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the journey. Take care.